Hello, everyone, and warm welcome to you from all around the country to this webinar on innovations in remote ESOL instruction. My name is Soya Kallenbach. I am with World Education and have been directing this project. And I have my co-presenters here, and they will be presented in later. But I'm going to turn this over now to Megan Morris, who will give you a quick overview of the platform we're using.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to be your technical assistant for today. So you can find your meeting controls at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And for the purpose of today's webinar, we are keeping everybody muted unless otherwise noted. You can raise your hand or chat into the chat box if you have a question. You can access the chat box by clicking the speech bubble icon, and please make sure that you're sending your message to everyone. If you need to send a message to me for direct technical assistance, you can simply click on my name to do so. If you have any other technical questions, you can reach out to Megan_Morris@worldec.org. Thank you.
Thanks, Megan. And we have a really great agenda for today. I'm going to take care of the project overview, and after that, I will turn it over to Jen and our 4 program panelists. Very interesting conversation on the offer for you around remote ESOL program designs and digital literacy. And then we'll turn it over to Johan Juven, who will talk about policy considerations and recommendations. And that will wrap up the hour that we have together. But for now, I would like to ask you to please use the chat function and just say your name, your title, and what kind of institution you're from. We'd love to know who's gathered here with us today. And for my part, this is what I'll talk about, a bit about the purpose, the process, what we learned, and what we have to share with you even after this webinar. So the purpose of this remote ESOL project really was to discover and capture all the learning you all and we all have been doing during this pandemic pivot to complete remote ESOL. We wanted to pause and really learn from it and see what is our collective experience and how that can inform how we move forward and what's innovative and scalable to help us meet the ever-growing demand for adult ESOL. The second purpose was to meet anticipated demand in the event of immigration reform and a pathway to citizenship, which will require English proficiency and would create a huge demand for more ESOL. For this project, what we did, we have a great team together. We solicited submissions. We received 52 applications or nominations from programs in all different kinds of contexts across the country, reviewed them carefully, and selected 35 programs from, again, around the country, representing community colleges, libraries, workplace-based programs, CBOs, school district-based programs. We interviewed them and reviewed various documents, their websites, and then did what we call a cross-case analysis to really try to get a sense of what are the common learnings? And I will share some highlights of those with you in just a bit. But first, a big shout out to our project team, Jen Van Eck, who will be moderating the panel coming up, Alison Asher-Weber, Annalisa Crow from World Ed, and our amazing consultants, including Johan Uvin, our lead consultant, Katarina Gonzalez, and Navjit Singh. It's been such a pleasure to work with you. It's a quick project, 6 months, and here we are able to share with you what we've learned. The programs whose information we're including in our various publications in our hot off the press website come from these shaded states, so you can see pretty good geographic spread and really interesting mix of organizations. And there's a clickable map on the project website, so you can actually find the name and your route to that organization. In the panel and in this project, we chose 8 very distinct programs with notable approaches to highlight as case studies. I'm not sure what happened to our numbering, but there are 8. Somehow the numbering got thrown off, and 4 of those programs are with us today presenting, because we just couldn't include 8. And you will hear from them in just a little bit. All of these case studies are on our website, and you'll get the URL is embedded in these slides and will be chatted by Megan. So what we learned, there's a lot that we learned. These are some of the common inputs. One of them, yeah, thanks, Philip. We are all number 1, yay. Strong leadership was definitely key and underlie what happened next. And it could come from program directors, deans, but also teachers who took leadership to design remote learning programs. Partnerships. Many programs strengthened their partnerships or even started new ones, particularly with community service providers to meet students' needs that were, of course, even more acute than ever before during the pandemic. Needs for food, for assistance in applying for unemployment, and lots more. There are also many programs that realized they needed to tighten their internal collaborations across departments in order to really create an effective program model. And these partnerships we documented and were impressed with how they help strengthen programs. It comes as no surprise to any of you that, of course, access to technology devices, internet data plans, and digital skills is central to any remote learning program. But how exactly you do that, that also varied from program to program. And there's some conversation about that coming up in our panel. Flexibility is really important to innovation. If your every move is determined by some policy or funding requirement, it's hard to innovate. And this pandemic time, many of you, I'm sure, experienced some of the accountability rules were made more flexible. And it allowed programs to experiment with new program designs, and really great innovation came out of that. And of course, ample professional learning and development, so teachers and staff could adapt to their new roles. And our Tech Center, of course, has played a big part in that as well, providing webinars almost weekly. The key outputs, many of the program models were similar in the end, a combination of synchronous live learning with asynchronous independent learning, but often relying on very different technologies or a range of them. Programs also found that they were able to reach different learners or even more learners because the barriers of transportation, childcare were removed. And finally, many programs found that their students were attending more regularly, were completing at higher rates, and even achieving higher learning gains. That's the highlights, high level. And at this point, let's move on, Jen, please. This is just a flash of the products you can find on our website that was launched last night, just in time for this webinar. But I am now going to turn this over to Jen and the panel.
Thanks, Celia. So we're going to be talking about some of the featured programs. As Celia said, we did have 8 case studies focused on programs, and many of those programs had already been featured in our distance education strategy session. So we wanted to give these others a chance to have their work highlighted across the country as well. So you can probably see your panelists on the screen. What we're going to do right now is give everyone a couple minutes to talk about their work. Then I am going to ask them a follow-up question, and then we bring the others into conversation. So you can see how these strategies and these innovations that were really salient in one organization are in fact evident in other organizations too. And I hope the multiple contexts will help you think about how you can then integrate them into the work that you're doing. All right, so we are going to get rolling. We're going to first hear about the work being done at Second Start. And I would like to introduce Mary Nolan from Second Start, program manager of the Connections program at New Hampshire Humanities, and also an ESOL teacher. Welcome, Mary. Just let me know when you would like me to advance some slides for you.
Thank you so much, Jen, for that introduction. And I'll just give a brief overview of Second Start and where we're located. We're located in the capital city of Concord, New Hampshire, which is considered urban, but we service a lot of students in surrounding urban and rural areas of the state. Concord's unique because we're a refugee resettlement location for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And Second Start specifically is a community-based organization offering ESOL classes, HiSET, adult diploma, alternative high school, daycare, and a new American driving school to our populations. Our ESOL program specifically services about 100 students through level day and night classes, predominantly to Spanish, Arabic, Nepali, and Swahili speaking communities. And you can head to the next slide, Jen. And so I've tried to create this diagram to show you how we went about designing our remote ESOL instruction at Second Start. So at the macro level, you see our curriculum is aligned to the Teaching the Skills That Matter and the college and career readiness standards. And I'm just going to drop a link to the Teaching the Skills That Matter in the chat. CCRS guided us with their English language standards for instruction, where Teaching the Skills That Matter were thematic units focused in the area of civics, financial literacy, workforce preparation, and health. And the medium through which these themes and standards manifested themselves was through a paper-based month-long curriculum tied exclusively to books provided by the Connections program at New Hampshire Humanities. And these books from the Connections program, which are predominantly children's literature, are at the heart of our curriculum at Second Start. Now, many of you may be wondering, how do adults receive children's literature? Like, is it insulting in any way, or are they engaged by it? Our students absolutely loved these stories, and I never want you to underestimate the power of children's literature. What my co-teacher and I, Cara Milano, did, who's on this call as well, we really stretched the content of these books. They're rich in grammar features and really contain some complex content. We use the books to teach highly relevant and engaging materials to our students' everyday lives. I'm just going to show a picture of a book. In our story about health, we were actually having students practice reading medicine bottles with us from their homes. We're also having them practice writing and speaking conversations with healthcare providers. In our book on financial literacy, in a story about a mother and family buying a chair, we actually had our students practicing counting money and creating budgets, outlining their savings and incomes. So these books, with their simple language and illustrations, really provide an accessible way into the history, humanities, and complex themes that our beginner ESOL population and class might otherwise not have an opportunity to engage in. Okay, and so the question that I'm going to answer now is how did we accommodate high and low tech approaches? And we had both low tech and high tech. Both approaches focused on this month-long paper-based curriculum designed entirely around those books and its themes. Packets were delivered by the Second Start Team Day supervisor, the co-teacher, or myself, since there are a lot of students that live in rural areas of the state, and a pickup or mail option was available as well. For our no-tech students, New Hampshire is a rural state. A few did not have internet access. So those students got their packets delivered to them. They read their books and worked on their packets alone, recorded their work time, and we just communicated with them through WhatsApp or text. For our high-tech option, Second Start was able to loan computers and iPads to students, but most are using their phones to access additional Zoom instruction, which again are tied completely to that book and paper-based learning packet. And they completed additional assignments via WhatsApp, Quizlet, or CellEd. And for us, again, the key partnership here was New Hampshire Humanities, the Connections program. And they provided copies of books free of charge to each student. They can also provide facilitated discussion from their trained facilitators free of charge, just upon request. And New Hampshire Humanities is the state affiliate for the National Endowment for the Humanities. And I would encourage all ESOL practitioners and programs on this call today to really look at your own state's humanities councils and see how they can support your ESOL instruction and programming. Humanities councils are located in all of the 50 states.
Thanks so much, Mary. Hey, I'd like to bring Sachko in here to respond. Sachko, I know that you also made use of a thematic curriculum. Can you talk a little bit, like in a minute, about your CCRS aligned approach to your instruction as it relates to themes in teaching?
Yes, so Santa Barbara City College's non-credit ESL program incorporated the college and career readiness standards in 2017, and we have just completed curriculum updates this year, integrating the English language proficiency standards to allow more scaffolding for the ESL learners. And our curriculum is also, thematically organized and contextualized and incorporates EL civics and aligns with the state's immigrant integration policy. And this past year, we tweaked our lesson plans a bit to include new relevant information such as telemedicine, COVID testing, and vaccination resources in the health unit, and also moratorium on evictions in the housing unit, and filling out, signing forms online in the digital literacy unit and so on. So we updated our curriculum and lesson plans to meet the needs of our students at this time of COVID.
Thank you so much, Sachko and Mary. So now I'd like to move on to the next program that we're featuring today. Kathy Grady is here with St. Paul ABE Hub Center, Minnesota. Many of you might know that's where I got started teaching adult basic education. So really glad to see you here, Kathy. And maybe Kathy's muted.
Sorry. I knew something like that would happen.
Usually me, Kathy.
What's that?
It's usually me.
Okay. So we are a large urban program. We are in St. Paul, Minnesota. We are run with the St. Paul Public Schools. And so we're part of St. Paul Public Schools community education program. We have our own building, and it's a large, wonderful building called the Ronald Hub Center. It was built in 1994. Not that you need to remember that, but it's really nice to have that space for our learners. We serve many, many learners every year. 3,300 plus ESOL learners last year. We have GED. We have obviously English language learning classes, a bunch of job training or IET classes, reading, math, computer skills. So we, of course, had an enormously huge learning curve when things suddenly shut down. And we were actually dealing with a strike, teacher strike, right before the COVID shutdown. And so we were just scrambling. But we gave our teachers a couple of weeks to plan. We started out on Zoom and moved to Google Meet after the security issues with Zoom. But a couple of things we did that I think made a difference for us. We both increased specialization by having, you'll see the slide here, by having digital push-in classes. Adam Kiefer, who is a tech savvy guy and who had been working in our distance learning program as well as teaching, pushed into the classes of all of our teachers, all the online classes. and taught digital literacy lessons on a wide variety of topics, from texting and email to Windows and operating systems, and you name it, he did it. And then we increased generalization, actually, of duties across our program. So we had been kind of siloed. Since we're a very large program, we had intake staff. It was great because I came from a nonprofit where we didn't have staff who were specialized in certain things, but we had testing staff, and then the teachers mostly taught. And they didn't do the onboarding. And so we got teachers and counselors and the intake staff all involved. Even the volunteer coordinator became an advisor. And we got them all involved in working online with students and onboarding them. So that not only helped those staff build their own digital literacy skills and know what students needed to know, and it also provided more touch points for our students. So sometimes they would call my cell phone at 8 at night, and that was okay because we were in emergency mode and we wanted students to be able to access our program. So
thanks so much, Kathy. That Pushing Digital Literacy program that you talked about, where Adam would come in and show teachers and students together how to do something that would then be used later in a lesson. Contextualizing digital literacy reminds me a lot of the Holyoke case study and the work that Pesha has done around coaching or mentorships. Pesha, can you say a little bit about how you supported digital literacy work at Holyoke?
Yeah, so I hear you, Kathy, on the emergency mode. And so as we were shifting sort of out of emergency mode, where I think what you described is absolutely true, that everyone was generally supporting students, we really started to notice that our advisors were being pulled in to do technology support, and were losing their opportunities to do the core of their work, of their advising with students. So we got a funding increase last fall through the Department of Ed. And we put hours in for 2 staff to be technology coaches. And so we built a referral system. Teachers and advisors could be referring students who needed particular supports to these coaches, who would then reach out and follow up with the student. They held multiple weekly drop-in sessions. So students who were having trouble could self-identify and just come and get support. They were available to do push-ins, as you described a little bit, into classrooms. And then they also ran a technology skills class this spring using North Star digital literacy assessments and the platform behind it. And we learned a lot, I think, both in terms of our own program capacity and our own staff skills, but also in terms of structure. And we certainly plan to continue doing this. Yeah.
Great. Thanks so much to Kathy and Pesha for talking about that digital literacy support. And now we're going to move back to Sachko Oates, a non-credit coordinator at Santa Barbara Community College School of Extended Learning. Sachko, tell us about your high and low intensity program options at SBCC.
Sure. Can we go to the next slide? Just a little bit about our context. We are a community college on the Central Coast of California that offers tuition-free ESL or ESOL courses to adult learners. And we have 2 main adult education campuses and about 10 offsite partner locations. And our service area has a population of about 220,000. It's a small town feel. Our non-credit ESL program served about 1,300 students this year. Our students are 70 to 75% Latino, Latina, Latinx, and 9 to 10% Asian students. This year, we served more women than usual. It's usually 60-40, separation, but this year, over 70% of our students were women, and I believe remote learning really supported women, especially the ones with small children or transportation issues, to participate in formal learning. But it might also be due to the fact that more women dropped out of the workforce during the pandemic. So that was a little bit interesting this year. Next slide, please. We chose synchronous remote learning with Zoom, mainly because the modality mimics our in-person structure, and learning with, instructor with the breakout room feature for small group discussions. And it was also the simplest approved methods through the California's community college system. So we chose the synchronous. You can see the students learning on Zoom here. And we made sure everyone had access to a computer and the internet, and we distributed more than 200 Chromebooks. And you can see one of the recipients here. Next, please. And our decision to provide courses with varied intensity levels was based on the students' needs. A few months after the COVID shutdown, we started hearing about the impacts of COVID on our students. Some became unemployed while others were working more hours on the front lines or struggling with children at home 24/7, which I could relate. Thus, having the options for high and low intensity courses supported the students in different situations. And our high intensity program aimed to upskill or equip our students with new skills for new employment. And when the college started planning the 8-week intensive back to work program funded by the Federal CARES Act funds, I wanted to make sure that our ESOL students are part of it and benefit from it. And our solution was to offer an IET model with ESL support for the 3 high demand career pathways: sustainable landscaping, construction, and personal care attendant. And we partnered with our Career Skills Institute, also part of the School of Extended Learning family, to offer those 3 tracks. And students attended about 32 hours a week of lessons for 8 weeks to complete the certificate programs. This is a very intensive program. And of the 70 plus students served in the first round, about 20 were English language learners. We were lucky to be able to use the federal grant to help students with their basic needs, such as childcare or stipends to attend the intensive courses. And on the other hand, we also offered low intensity learning circles focused on conversational English to keep the busy students engaged and connected to the learning community. We piloted learning circles with World Education a few years back, and it was a great success, and we institutionalized the model. And this particular class met only once a week for 2-3 hours at a time. And it's an open entry, open exit with no commitment. So this was very a great option for busy students. And the instructor, usually keeps in touch with all students, even the ones from the past, through a texting app. So it's very casual. And we offer everything in between those, super high intensity to low intensity programs to meet the students' diverse needs.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much, Sachko. No, I'm interested in hearing about how others took on the IET work remotely. And Kathy, I think you mentioned, and I remember reading in the case study that Hub Center did some IET work. Can you just briefly say how you made that work?
Sure. There were a variety of ways we made it work. We did have some of the classes already were online and already had an online course. So those teachers for Serve Safe, for Intro to Nursing Assistant, were able to just take that course, brush it off, and use it. So that was wonderful. And then our Intro to Small Business class was a new program funded by the Minnesota Department of Economic Development. And that teacher luckily was highly skilled in digital literacy. And so she immediately went and put that on Google Classroom, and the grant, actually, we talked to the funders, and the grant allowed us to pay for refurbished laptops for our students. So I actually ended up delivering some of these laptops to students' homes during the height of the pandemic. That was great. And then the third thing that allowed us to offer these classes online, things like the commercial driver's license class has been taught by a man who, we'll just say that he's been retired for a very long time, and he did not have very high digital literacy skills. So we did a lot of hand-holding. One of our supervisors was on every single Google Meet with him for a long time until we were sure that things were working well. And And he was just so game for it. And he was so energetic about it and so excited. Yes, Judy. And that it just made it so fun for all of us to watch his skills improve. So anyway, there's another teacher too who has been retired for a while, and luckily she is the mother of our supervisor. So she would go to our supervisor's house and teach her building maintenance class online from Renata's house. And so I could talk all day about it.
That's great. So thank you so much, Sajko, for talking about the varying intensities, and for Kathy sharing how you're integrating, how both of you are integrating IET, which I know is a tough nut to crack in remote instruction. So our last panelist, I'm going to move on to Pesha Black from Holyoke Community College, Massachusetts. And Pesha's going to tell us about some key features of independent study options and how they work for different levels of students. Welcome, Pesha.
Yeah, thanks for having us all, Jen. This is a lot of fun. So Holyoke Community College is located in Western Massachusetts. We serve about 350 ESOL students each year in multiple program sites in a few different communities. This year, we were serving students who live in about 55 different communities all over Massachusetts. So not just Western Mass. I think that parallels the experiences of a lot of people that all of a sudden our service area expanded pretty dramatically when everything went remote. And our students typically speak about 30 plus languages, are from more than 50 countries. It's a very linguistically and culturally diverse area and group of students. And so you're seeing here really just a quick overview of what the program design looked like this year as we went remote. All of our students had synchronous and asynchronous instruction. At the lower levels, we included small group synchronous work. Students really needed that smaller, more supportive environment to be successful. Classes included a component that we're calling independent learning. I'll talk about that. They also had more traditional homework, which was directly connected to what they had done in class, and students were all doing the same thing in that part. I also just listed out our wraparound supports. It's a really important part of what we do, including a job seekers club run with our local one-stop career centers. And so that was an important focus of our work as well. Go ahead. And I wanted to talk a little bit about independent learning and student choice in particular. And so this really, I would say, came out of a relatively inefficient model that we had in the spring, right as the pandemic closed our building. And so we defined independent learning to have 4 characteristics, or focus on metacognition, on student choice, students demonstrating their learning in some way, and making sure that the learning is connected to students' goals or purposes for learning. So at the lower levels, there's way more significant teacher direction and support, as you'd expect. At the higher levels, it's a much more flexible array of student choices. But in all of the levels, we're really thinking about how we help students build their independent learning skills so that they can be thoughtful, strategic learners with a repertoire of strategies that they can use, and learning routines that they can use with content both inside the class, but then outside of the class, right? We'll go to the next one. Yeah, so I want to give you a little bit of a snapshot of what this might look like at some different levels. So at a lower level, so for example, at level 2, we built goal groups. And so this was how the small groups evolved. They became sort of mini classes focused around students' goals based on students' interests, and students were picking which goal groups they wanted to be a part of. So you can see the topics here from this sort of winter-spring trimester: health, career, citizenship, and current events, personal narrative option, and then education and career goals. And so the independent learning that students were doing was flowing out of these groups. It was really an extension that was connected to the theme. And it was a really exciting model for students. We're trying to figure out how we generalize it more broadly for the fall. And then at higher levels, independent learning looked much more like menus of options. And so some of those options would be live, right? So things like conversation groups that students could join, both run through our own program, but also run out of libraries and other places in Massachusetts that we were connecting them to. And then there were on-demand kinds of resources. You can see the types of skills students were working on. And that included digital literacy. It again, included both live and on demand. In all the cases, then students were completing Google Form reflections within Google Classroom or working through a learning log, and teachers were meeting with students to sort of help redirect them as needed on their path. So in both of these versions, right, there's really an important shift. We're trying to think about moving responsibility from teachers to students and sort of a partnership of teachers and students, an experience that's much more tailored and builds their independent learning skills as they leave us and as they continue on.
That's great. Oh, thanks, Pesha. So I think I want to talk a little bit more, like another minute about independent learning. And Mary, I know at Second Start, you also were focused on supporting opportunities for independent learning in reading. Can you just say a little bit more about the independent aspect of that and how students were kept engaged in that work?
Sure. Sending the connections books and the paper-based learning curriculum home to students allowed them to focus on English language instruction when it was convenient for them without having to worry about accessing technology. And so we built in some supports to help them with that work. We set out a pacing calendar of activities you should complete this week, but students were really allowed to go at their own pace, faster or slower, depending on what their work or life demanded. And those that could join our high-tech option went a little bit more in depth into those topics. We asked students we taught them how to keep track of their work time outside of class using the stopwatch feature on their phone. For our Two Friends civics book right here, students logged an average of 6 additional hours of English language instruction on their own independent learning time. And we saw 38% of our students have measurable gains on CASAS and TAB tests. So it takes some time. And I really liked what Pesha said about the partnership between the teacher and the students, because I think that's really important, but that independent piece has been convenient for them for work and life.
Yeah, and I'd add the independence also around choice and supporting learner persistence and personalization. It's really impressive. Both of you, thank you so much for doing that work. So I do believe we have like a minute. If there are any really important questions that have come out. Actually, I see one popped up right now on my screen. Phil, hi Phil, asks, I think this question, I'm not sure who this question is for, but would anybody like to talk briefly about measurable skill gain on the CASAS test? Who's doing CASAS tests? And
I think that was for us that we just finished out it. Phil, I can send you a private message just about what we considered a measurable gain.
Actually, if you wouldn't mind putting that in the chat, that would be great.
Sure.
Thanks everybody. And Rachel, you have a question, but somebody said how did you communicate options to level 2 so that they understood the choices? I think that's to Pesha.
Oh yeah, so we had a brilliant teacher, Ash Elengina, working on this and sort of devising the model. They came up, the options surfaced from the students themselves, right? So they sort of were talking about goals and figuring out what they'd want to learn more about. Then the teacher took those options, sort of packaged them, and then students filled out, they talked about them in class and students filled out a Google form where they picked their options, and then we formed groups off of those options.
Thank you so much to everybody that took the time to share your work. The goal of this panel discussion was to get you all interested in reading these case studies and the other case studies that are on our site. So I hope we have accomplished that. And now we're going to move into the last phase of this work. An equally important aspect of this project was to examine how all of these programs that we investigated, to examine the context in which they were operating, and part of that context is policy. And so Johan has led the authoring of this wonderful policy brief that talks a little bit about how policy might be shifted or is implicated in the scalability of some of these innovations. So welcome so much, Johan. It's really been wonderful working with you on this project, and welcome to this webinar.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome again. I want to quickly thank the programs. I want to thank the project team for their incredible work. I want to thank our anonymous funder for this project, which made all of this work possible. I won't name them. And I want to thank all the adult learners who actually decided to continue their engagement and persist during this very, very difficult time that we're in. Caused by the COVID-19 virus. when we look at what is in this practice and policy brief, and it's actually both a practice brief and a policy brief, this is what's in there, okay? There are so many resources in there that I'm not going to talk about, but there's a description of the rationale for the project, why we did it, the description of the project. There's a high-level summary of all the findings that some of the panelists and Celia have already touched upon. There is a practice analysis that actually looks at what were the facilitating conditions and resources that made this transition to remote ESOL possible, or the continuation of remote ESOL in some cases possible. And then when we looked at all this work, what are some of the policy and funding implications, and what can we learn from this in terms of how we should think about scaling up these practices? So with that is what is in the brief itself. What I'm going to highlight today is on the practice side, I'm going to talk about what are sort of the key facilitating conditions and factors, particularly zeroing in on leadership and resources. And then on the policy side, I will talk a little bit about the grassroots collaborative approach that we are recommending to build a remote adult ESOL system. And then I'll talk a little bit about the policy recommendations. There are many policy actions and recommendations that are featured in the brief for anyone who is in this ecosystem at all levels, but I will exclusively talk about the policy recommendations as they relate to the federal government. So we can transition to the next slide. Jen, Celia mentioned that one of the key findings was, and a key facilitating condition was leadership. And she also pointed out that leadership can be at different levels. Sometimes staff have taken leadership on, sometimes teachers, as Celia mentioned. But in many, many cases, what we learned is that the commitment and the support of sort of executive leadership, such as a CEO, a CFO, a chief operating officer, a college dean, an executive director of an agency, a school principal, that commitment and leadership is really critical, particularly when we think about the issue of resources. Now, interestingly, and this is sort of a high-level summary of an overview of decisions that leaders made. Several of the leaders we interviewed said that, oh man, it would have been really interesting if we had sort of a list of decision-making moments when you think about making this transition. So we analyzed everything that all the 35 programs had to say about how they made this transition and actually distilled a set of decision-making points that they all seem to have gone through, and then articulated some associated actions. The full overview of that is in the brief, and you can also access it on the website separately as a resource document. But here is just a couple of highlights from that to give you a flavor, and I won't talk through all of these. I'm just going to pick one, the first one, and then illustrate that. So clearly, once you have made the decision to either continue your program remotely or go towards a remote adult ESOL learning program, there's a lot of decisions to be made about making sure that the technology infrastructure is there, including devices and so forth. So there's a whole set of decisions that people had to make around that. And the outcomes of those decisions were quite different. In some cases, programs decided to just purchase laptops for everybody with everything on it, ready to go. Laptops. Others established iPad lending libraries, or as we heard from one of our panelists, provide a Chromebook. So, but this is just an illustration of one of the critical decisions that people had to make as they were making this transition, or as they were expanding or maintaining their remote ESOL program. There are many, many more. We try to be as comprehensive and inclusive as possible in terms of all the key decisions to be made, and they can be found in detail, in the brief itself and some accompanying resources. I want to say just a few words about money and about resources and what we learned. clearly, none of the programs could have anticipated that the entire world was going to face a pandemic, and therefore they could not plan for this or budget for this. And then it seems that some programs had some reserves, and they were able to sort of tap into that to purchase some equipment and pay for some of the startup costs. But many other programs really felt a need to aggressively engage in fundraising to supplement the resources that they have, and that allowed them then, for instance, to either purchase devices and distribute them, or to create lending libraries. What seems to be the case is that this myth that remote learning is cheaper, that doesn't necessarily hold. And we learned from the experiences of these 35 programs that the cost actually varies greatly by model and the scale at which one is trying to implement the program. And we felt that this was one key motivation for continuing to ask funders to make investments in continued research around this. What we do know is that in addition to the initial startup costs, if you will, or the costs associated with making the transition or building out the remote program, there are some significant sort of ongoing costs. It's not just, pay for all you need up front once, and then you don't have any of these costs anymore. There are a significant amount of cost associated with sustaining the effort. There's also, in some of the case studies, we've highlighted that people had to make some significant changes about how they kept and allocated their staff and what staff were doing, changes in roles and so forth. But that is also described in more detail. So what I want to do is go and talk a little bit about policy. So our real goal in making these policy recommendations is that we would get to the point in our country that at the community level, there actually would be an ecosystem for remote ESOL learning. And in this beautiful visual that the team put together, we sort of see the key constituent groups, and clearly, the immigrant and refugee and asylum seeker adults are sort of at the center of this. But we believe that if we could incentivize the creation of these grassroots collaboratives around remote ESOL learning, that many things can actually fall into place that are currently not happening, because at this point, most of the funding goes to individual agencies, and therefore people sort of operate in their individual organizational universe, if you will. And we think if we really want to make sure that all adult learners who could benefit from remote ESOL learning can do so, then we need to create this type of local collaborative process, grassroots process. And in the practice and policy brief, we actually name who all the different constituent groups are that should be involved in doing that. And we propose a 10-step process that people can follow if they wish to pursue this at the local level. The key idea behind this process is very simple, and this is based on many years of experience that so many practitioners and policymakers have, that if you want to create effective practice or effective policy, you have to start by involving the people who will be affected by the practice or the policy. And when you do that, and that's exactly what we're proposing here with this 10-step local process, when you do that, then the likelihood of your efforts being effective has just increased significantly. I'd mentioned in my overview that we have many opportunities for people at all levels to take policy actions. But we did also articulate some specific policy recommendations for the federal government. I'm not going to read all of these to you, but they have to do with, let's make sure that all this remote ESOL work and related costs, that these are allowable uses of funds. Let's make sure that we pay attention to the outcomes of remote learning and sort of when we articulate new accountability expectations. And then there's some obvious ones, of course, here as well, but I'm going to just highlight the third one here. We have found that based on the experiences of these 35 programs, that digital onboarding has to be like a key part of this, and not just only to facilitate access to the learning opportunity, but also because digital literacy should be recognized as a new foundational skill, along with numeracy, literacy, English language ability, and so forth. Because our students are entering a labor market where digital proficiency is an expectation. It's expected that you have that basic foundational skill. And so we think that this has many, many implications for how people think about the reauthorization of critical federal statutes like the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, and not just Title II of that act, but all the other titles as well, so that digital literacy would be not only recognized as important and should be an allowable and fundamental activity, but it should actually be viewed not just as an instrumental skill set to access learning, but actually as a critical job skill to be successful. Want to end here. I won't talk about this much, but there are two sort of things happening on the policy space that I want everyone to be aware of. One is the Department of Education has issued guidance, and this is a short-term thing, right? So if you're not involved in these conversations after our webinar today, get on the phone, talk to the people who are making these decisions in your districts. But there is funding available under the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Fund and under the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Funds. And these distance learning activities and the purchase of technology for student use is an allowable use of those funds. And English language learners who are under the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act, which is Title II of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, would also, through an LEA or other eligible entity, be able to actually access these funds. Lastly, really quick, but I won't talk about it because it's not a reality yet. I'm praying that it will become a reality, is the Digital Equity Act got introduced. And I think we have a link in the chat, or we'll post a link in the chat to this if you wish to familiarize yourself more with what is happening there. So with that, I think I hope I stayed within my time. Yes, I stayed within the time I was allotted, Jen. So I'm turning it back over to you.
Brilliant timing. Thanks. And we do have some links that will be put in the chat, the links to the federal policy that Johan touched on, and also a link to the Digital Equity Act. If somebody from our team could throw those in the chat, that would be great. Okay, so I think we have one question. We can take a question from Phil. Oh, actually, Judy just answered it, I think. Phil, did you get your question answered? It's about, are there any federal regulations preventing WIOA grant recipients from serving students with remote who live outside of their geographic area? And I think Judy said those, oh, actually, I'm not sure. Do anybody have a response to that, to Phil?
Well, I would say that if it's outside of the state, that could be problematic from the state and point of view, but I don't think it's written into WIOA.
Yeah. Great.
There was also a question from Fred about, are funders more willing to give money to remote programs? And I, for one, don't know, but I think if you can show that you reach perhaps more learners or new learner populations So you're increasing access, and if there's more learner engagement and persistence, then that's the way to perhaps convince funders. But, you know,
I
That's
think
the-
also there's an advocacy role here, right?
mhm,
One of the big takeaways for me with this whole COVID thing is that we have seen the accelerated, excuse me, the accelerated introduction of remote adult ESOL learning due to a shock to our economy and our society being COVID, which would have taken many, many more years to achieve without that shock. Now that programs have figured out how to do this, and at least the 35 programs we talked to were able to achieve this, and many of them are hoping to continue at least a remote option as part of what they're doing. I think the advocacy point here is to just make sure that all public funders, federal, state, and local, and funders in philanthropy acknowledge this new reality. The field has changed. The field has transformed, and it has done so in less than 24 months.
yes, and there's a question from David about the higher persistence and outcomes for in remote flex programs, and there's some answers Pesha already answered. We definitely saw that in the data from many programs that reported higher level of engagement as in attendance and participation. I think Mary noted that from Second Start, and really our 4 panelists today are just 4 out of 34 programs that we had the honor to interview and whose work is documented to different extent in our different documents. And probably in the interest of time, I need to turn this over to you, Jen, about the resources.
Right. So I am not going to take the time to do a tour of resources. But what I want to point out to you, and Megan, if you could please chat the link again, that would be great. We have created a whole website that is a resource for you. We feature a great paper on equity practices in serving diverse learners. Soon we will have a paper up on promising practices, instructional practices. We have our case studies. You know, our case studies reflect these programs that you heard today, plus 4 others, plus a couple national level programs, English at Work from the National Immigration Forum and English Innovations as national level models. So I do hope that you will go to the website. We're going to be featuring articles from this and sharing them out in our newsletter and tweeting, but you are getting the first access to this website from, you know, it's just seriously now live. So I hope that you will check it out and continue to follow it. Of course, Johan's paper and presentation from on the policy work will be there. And we have actually separated out some of the key resources that Johan highlighted today as PDF resources that you can use in your work. Want to just flag that coming up, as you know, the EdTech Center is leading the country in service learning for adult basic skills, adult foundational skills teachers, in crowdsourcing resources that we can all use while we're learning how to use them. So please do sign up, and please chat the link to this, Megan. You can register for our summer camp, our EdTech Makerspace Summer Camp, which will be coming up starting in July, running through July and August. And with that, Celia, I'll turn it over to you to close.
Okay, well, thank you everyone so much for joining us. Thank you to our panelists and to Jen. And again, a big shout out to the whole remote ESOL EdTech team. I hope you will visit the website and check out some of the resources. And we will follow up with the record, an email that has the recording of this webinar, as well as a request for your feedback, which you can provide by taking this QR code right away. We not only want to hear about your experience in this webinar, and I'm sorry it was so packed with information that some folks felt we were going too fast. We probably did. But we also want your feedback and suggestions for next steps. So we'd really appreciate all of you sending us some feedback, either with this QR code. We're going to keep this webinar open for another 10 minutes. So you have time to pick it up and tell us how we should follow up on all this. And I think with that, I am going to close and thank all of you who are doing remote ESOL, and lots of gratitude to all the 34 programs that we were able to connect with and interview. Incredible work was done in this pandemic year, and we can all learn from it moving forward.
Yeah. Thanks all. Have a great weekend.
Oh yeah, it's a weekend. Have a good weekend. And we can provide a certificate of completion to someone's question. Just email Megan or one of us, and we will send you a certificate of completion.
Great.